Wilbur and I started dating a few months ago. We'd met at a games night at a mutual friend's house, and he seemed alright. We were spooky in the same ways, and I got goosebumps when he rolled the letters of my name around his mouth incorrectly, squishing them between his tongue and the roof of his mouth. It was strange, and I adore strange. Dating was slow at the start, only seeing each other once a week or so. He'd said I was his first girlfriend, and I hadn't had good luck with men. After we'd broken down the ideas that the other one was going to flee in terror, we took off. It was typically at my house. He said he liked my apartment more. I had a bigger television. It was easier for him to get to mine than it was for me to get to his. To compensate, he'd bring over groceries and I'd cook our meals. We'd watch movies or play video games together. He always insisted on going home at night, saying he didn't want to overstay his welcome. It felt weird we were always at my house, but the few times I went to his house, I always felt creeped out, and not in a good way. There was something about his house that I couldn't shake. When we were over there, he'd keep me in the cramped living room, with its walls covered in anime posters and his prized Fumo collection, and would follow me to the bathroom if I needed to use it. He had a decently sized place, but every door was always shut, and had a weird musty smell. He claimed mold, that the landlord wouldn't do anything about it, so we kept it closed off from the rest of the house. Landlords suck, so I didn't think much of it. I didn't mind having him around, and it seemed like we were getting to a point of moving in together. Until he just stopped texting me. He'd been acting weird for about a week, and then one day, he didn't come over after work. He hadn't texted me since the morning of the day prior. I called his store, I called his mother, I texted him a few times. No one had seen him that day or any day prior. Everyone had assumed he'd been sick, as that's what he had told them. I felt a creeping cold at my spine, and there was only so much I could do to negate my anxiety spiraling out of control. We had talked early on about giving each other space if needed, but it always come with the condition that we check in via text, and when he didn't meet that condition, I panicked. Before I knew it, I'd taken 3 buses to his house. I found the key under the mat, but when I went to unlock it, the door was already unlocked. The house was silent, in the coldest way. Nothing seemed to make noise, not even my footsteps on the carpet. When I moved, it was like I was on another airplane and only an observer to the inside of the house. I called out his name and my voice didn't travel. The light switches didn't turn anything on. It was the strangest thing, and again, not in a good way. The goosebumps on my arm called me a coward. I first checked the kitchen and found a lot of dirty dishes in the sink. Bales of used plastic wrap in the garbage, and a hunk of uncovered and graying meat in the fridge. The bathroom was so dingy and grimy, smears of something were everywhere across the tiles. I couldn't place the smell, but it was familiar. The somersaults in my gut didn't stop as I opened the door to his bedroom. I had only been in there once, and when I had been very drunk. It was the first time we'd slept together, and he'd made me stand on the wall while he tied it up, and I waited as he hid his anime body pillows. He'd mentioned the collection to me earlier that night, and I told him it was fine. I didn't remember much else other than that, and how much stamina he seemed to have, as we went at it, and how lumpy his bed had felt after. It had been the only time I'd stayed over. I hesitated before opening the door and decided to knock, just in case. Each rap of my knuckle against the wood fell to the floor in the oppressing din of the cramped hallway. I felt as though I could have picked them up from the commercial carpeting. There was something greasy feeling on the door handle, and when I didn't hear anything from the room, I turned it. "What the fuck are you doing?" he barked from the front hall. I jumped at his voice and cracked the door open. Before I had a chance to pull it shut, he was on it, slamming it hard with a whoosh of air that immediately began waging war on my sinuses. I couldn't breathe. I'm sorry, Wilbur. I just hadn't heard from you and thought maybe you'd gotten hurt. I couldn't get a hold of you, and no one has seen you in a week. Why did you tell everyone that you were sick?" But he wasn't in the mood to answer questions. He demanded that I get out of the house, screaming that I was ruining everything. He pushed me out the front door and threw my purse in my face as I tried to reason with him. But all that got me was another door slammed and a rain-drenched walk back to the bus stop as I convinced myself to forget the sinewy thing that I had seen in the room. The twitching sinewy thing in a bright-colored costume with bright red lips. It took about a week or 2 for him to calm down, and he didn't really talk to me for any of it. Once that time passed, he just showed up like nothing happened, and we resumed living the way we had. He refused to talk about it, and if I tried to bring it up, he'd smile, hush me, roll my name out like when we had met. Just forget about it. It was nothing. He was extra affectionate, but rarely was I in the mood. There hadn't been any red flags in this relationship, and the overwhelming nature of them cascading all at once sent me into a weird paralysis. A month or so down the line, he acted as though it had never happened. Out of a growing fear of what he might do if I didn't forget about it, I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing. Nothing, that is, until he told me he was going away on a work trip. Some convention needed him somewhere, and he was going to be gone for 4 days. I felt a sudden grip in my chest when he told me, as if he'd immediately see on my face what I'd been thinking about doing, if I ever were given that chance. I told him that it sounded fun. He hadn't been to a con since before we'd gotten together. It'd be good to get back into it. I did my best to not sound overly ambitious about it, but if I had, he didn't indicate that he'd picked up on it. He was leaving the next day, and I'd be on my own for a while. Think you could handle it? He chuckled as he sniffed my hair and kissed my ear, smiling. I froze and reminded myself that everything was fine, but I couldn't stand his fingers gripping my arm. I took a deep breath and laughed out a yes. I drove him in his car to the airport the next day, and I waited to make sure he got through security. What I'd seen in that bedroom was eating at me inside, and I just needed to confirm in my anxious brain that I was right, that it was nothing. I'd just misseen something. With him gone, that meant that I could do it undetected. He'd never have to know I was in his house, and then, when I did what I needed to do, and knew that I hadn't seen anything, we could absolutely go back to normal. I even thought about the unspoken apology meal I was going to make as I navigated the narrow streets in his car. When I pulled up to his house, it stood as sullen and creepy as it had the last time I was here. I quietly shut the car off and sat in the seat, the anxiety-induced need to pee overcoming me. I ignored it and sat for a while staring at the door. I couldn't do this. I should just leave now. Actually, forget about it. It was nothing. Wilbur had said it was nothing. I should have believed him. That's what a good girlfriend does. A small voice in my head rang out. If I was so sure it was nothing, then why not go to see the nothing? Then my feet were on the pavement, my hand on the knob. This time, it didn't open, and there was no key under the mat. I walked back down the stairs and stared at the front of the house. Maybe because I'd been there so rarely, but I hadn't noticed that Wilbur's house had a basement. The bushes along the sides were terribly overgrown, but I noticed glinting in the midday sun, and when I pulled the branches away, it exposed a window. To my surprise, the window was unlocked. The basement itself was musty and pitch black. I could smell it, even without disturbing the glass. It looked relatively empty. Wilbur had said he had a mold problem, and his basement was likely to blame for most of it. As soon as I started to lower myself into the gloom on the blackened basement, all the sound disappeared from the world again, just like it had the first time. To my surprise, the ground was soft and spongy, musty earth, and that oh-so-familiar but unplaceable smell. The wall wasn't hard to find, but the stairs upwards were, and my shoes were wet by the time they planted themselves on the concrete. It was quieter in the stairwell and even darker. The stairs were carpeted now. A drop from upstairs made me freeze. There was no way he was there. The airport was at least 30 minutes away by car, and over an hour by bus. But the thought of something hitting the floor had been very real, and everything inside me was screaming to leave. I was going to get caught. I couldn't leave, though. I needed to know. The stairs led to a door that opened up right outside the bathroom. How I'd never seen it before astounded me, and I left the door open as I stepped into the hallway. The thump had come from a room I had never been, right across from the basement stairs. Wilbur had said it was just a storage room. The door opened with a small click and a tinkling. Tiny bells were tied around the inside of the doorknob. The smell that washed over me added to the somersaults and angry noises coming from my stomach. It was a sweet and sticky smelling, but sickening. It was dark, and I moved my hand along the inside of the wall, feeling for a switch. I was astounded when the light actually came on and revealed a room. Every inch of the wall space was covered in a series of large glass display cases containing an anime-themed oversized body pillow featuring a female character in various states of undress and sexual arousal. The border of every case had pictures, clippings, and notes taped to it, each with a key in the lock of the door handle. Candles crested the carpet of the room, and some looked as though they'd been burned recently. It was a disturbing shrine to his body pillows. That's when I noticed a key on the carpet that must have fallen from one of the cases. It was heavy when I picked it up, and I realized it was what had hit the floor. I found the case it belonged to and stopped as I slid the key into the hole. Something twitched. Or did it? I looked up and down the large body pillowcase, a giant-chested vampire with pink hair and one hand on her breast and the other poised at her bikini line, and waited. Nothing was moving. A trick of light? The mold getting to my head? Probably my reflection in the glass. I was going to investigate Wilbur's room when I heard a small tapping noise. Then the key hit the ground again. It was the same key as before. Horror movies taught me a lot, and I left it on the floor this time, ignoring the creepy feeling of dread in my spine. I checked Wilbur's room and found more body pillows. I knew what was in there. I'd been in that room before. I opened the door and found blank pillows and long blank cases. There was nothing to open or see that wasn't something I had already known about. At this point, I felt pretty stupid. The anxiety in my stomach bated a bit as I looked around this cramped and slightly musty room, sitting on his lumpy bed. The smell was not as bad here. It truly was the worst mattress I'd ever come into contact with. It was as if there was no padding in it at all, but boulders and driftwood. How anyone sleeps on that night after night? I went to leave. I was going to shut the doors and turn off all the lights and climb back through the weirdly soft basement and never bring it up again. Of course, it had been nothing. I'd just seen body pillows is all. That's it. I was a complete and absolute moron. Wilbur deserved better. I'd make this up to him, even if he'd never known I was here. I was going to do better. My sitting on the bed had ruffled the covers. I went to smooth them to hide my presence. As I placed my hands on the comforter to smooth it, something pushed back. It was ever so slight, but I didn't imagine that. Something was moving. My fear should have shot my curiosity at that moment, shot and buried it out back. But I couldn't not look. Every wave of every emotion I had felt over the last month collected in my stomach as I pulled back the blankets, emptied onto the carpet. There were no sheets on the bed. Hell, there was barely a bed. The top fabric of the mattress was almost completely gone, replaced by clear plastic. Where springs should have been, were. Well, they didn't look like anything human. From their costumes, I assumed they were women, but their skin was tight against their bones, to the point they looked like skeletons. Blood was caked on, old cuts and dark bruises blended together to form a giant bouquet of pain. They wore immaculate costumes I'd seen on the body pillows in the other room, their hair hidden under wigs. The one closest to me had eyes that flickered open, and she slowly reached a hand against the plastic sheeting, her lips barely moving. I pulled the plastic away from them, and the fetid odor tousled my stomach again, but there was nothing else for me to vomit. I touched her cold and almost lifeless hand as she closed her eyes. Touching the other three women, I could tell that they were dead. They had been for some time. No pulse, no warmth, no nothing. I called 911 on my phone and told the operator exactly where I was, that she needed to send help immediately. She told me the police were on the way and asked me to stay on the phone. I took it away from my ear to put her on speakerphone so I could use my hands. That's when I heard the tapping come from the shrine in the room. I peeled away from the almost dead woman in the magical girl costume and walked back into the spare bedroom. My nerves were on fire. I heard a soft crying from the case with no key. Picking it back up and sliding into the lock, I opened the door. The weight of the pillows was not what I had been expecting, and it fell onto me as soon as the door was unlocked. The bottom of the pillow was open and 2 feet peeked from the bedding. I wasn't sure what to say as I heard the operator on the phone in the other room asking what's going on. The soft crying continued from the pillow. I tore at the seams, pulling bedding away until I found the woman's head. She wasn't as gone as the others. She didn't look like a skeleton too much. Her mouth was full of cotton bedding, and when I pulled it out, she cried loudly. Please don't. Please don't. I'm begging you. I'm here to help. I've called the police. I tried to say in a reassuring and calm voice, but I was anything but that. The woman was in bad shape, bruises along her thighs and stomach, and both of her eyes blackened, bite marks on her breast and collarbone. I shouted at the operator that the police needed to hurry, that there were more victims here. My eyes grew wide as I looked around at the glass cases. There were nearly 30 of them. How could Wilbur have done this? The woman in the pillow grabbed my wrist and I startled. I know you, she said, tears in her eyes. Her nose started to bleed. What do you mean? I asked. You, she gasped. You're in there. She indicated to the basement door and coughed. I helped her sit up and leaned her against the case. I stayed with her as the police arrived and was swept away in a cop car after they took my statement. I watched them load her into the ambulance. She was the only survivor. The paramedics hadn't seen anything like it in their careers, and the police were equally shocked. After the investigation, they found an estimated 68 bodies hidden in areas of the house. 30 of them, including the woman I'd pulled out of the pillow, were in glass cases. There were 4 hidden in his bed. 7 were found in the dilapidated shed. Several were in pieces and scattered around the yard. They found bundles of hair in the body pillows on his bed. They'd even found them in the attic of his garage, each preserved in costume and makeup. The ME suggested that each had been starved of all foods and liquids, all had been assaulted numerous times before and after death, and preserved in a mixture of formaldehyde and lye. The woman was able to fill the rest of her details. Wilbur had asked her to come over to model a cosplay. He'd posted online looking to photograph some people. She said he had been very flirty and they had good chemistry. She got into the costume and he started to compliment her on how good she looked in the very skimpy vampire bikini. He was snapping pictures and having her pose more and more erotic. It was very obvious to her that he was aroused by it, and they ended up having sex, and they didn't use a condom. That's when he drugged her. She said she woke up on the couch in his living room and she couldn't move. Wilbur had moved her there, and now she was nude. He was still taking pictures of her. He said he'd take care of her if she did what he said, but that was all lies. It continued from there. The girl was an undergrad from a small town nearby. She didn't know how long she'd been here, but it must have been a couple of weeks. I asked to meet her. I needed to know what she meant when she said I was in the basement. I wanted to apologize for not knowing what had been going on, but she refused to see me. She wanted nothing to do with me or Wilbur. I can't entirely blame her, though. It wasn't until later that night I'd found out what she meant. In the basement, they'd found a coffin of sorts and a body pillow cover. The cover was printed with a picture of me, bits of my hair pinned to its top, fingernails on its sides. Even used a sanitary napkin from my bathroom that was attached to the pillow. They found tons of Wilbur's DNA in the fibers of just the pillow, just like the rest of the body pillows in the house. I don't know what any of that was for, and I don't want to know. Wilbur was already my boyfriend. People who knew us would have noticed had I gone missing, but I am haunted by the thought had I stayed longer, I also would have been added to the collection as his prized piece. Thank you all for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications. I really enjoyed this story. It really creeped me out. Be sure to check out the author's Reddit down below and give them a follow on Twitter.